She knew every law but theirs. A name is a debt, a heart is a catastrophe. And in a candlelit winter, where every gesture is a sentence, a man must choose what he's willing to burn. Listen close. We open this story now. The invitation had arrived on paper so heavy it bent her wrist when she lifted it. Cream-coloured, edged in a silver that was not ink, but something woven into the fibre itself, so that it caught the lamplight and threw it back at her like a small, cold accusation. Hermione Granger had read it 4 times before she understood that it was not a request. It was a summons dressed in the manners of a request, which was, she would learn, the first and most important thing to understand about the world she was being sent into. Now she stood at the threshold of a ballroom she had last seen in nightmares, and the room did not remember her at all. They had restored it. That was the thing that made her throat tighten. Not ruin, but restoration. The floor where she had once lain with her cheek against the cold parquet, screaming, had been sanded and oiled until it glowed the warm honey of old amber. Where there had been the iron tang of fear in the air, there was now beeswax and white lilies, and the faint green bite of crushed yew from the garlands. 200 candles burned in floating tiers above the dancers, and not one of them guttered. The manor had folded its horrors away beneath beauty, the way a woman folds a letter she does not intend to answer. And Hermione understood that she was meant to find this gracious. Breathe, she told herself. You are here to watch. You are not here to feel anything. She had come on the ministry's writ, with the dull title of Heritage Observer pinned to her like a borrowed coat, sent to learn whether the revived season was tradition or something with teeth beneath the lace. Kingsley had been honest with her at least. They're closing ranks, Hermione. Marriages, alliances, the old money flowing back into the old channels. We need eyes inside that aren't frightened of the room. She had said yes because she was not frightened of rooms. She had been wrong about that, but only a little, and only here. The trouble was that the room knew she did not belong, and it had 100 small ways of saying so. She felt it the moment she crossed the threshold, and the murmur did not stop. That was the tell. When one of them arrived, the murmur paused, gathered, redirected itself like a current finding a new stone. When she arrived, the conversation simply flowed around her as though she were a draught from a badly hung door. A woman in dove-grey silk glanced at Hermione's gown, a perfectly good gown, deep blue, chosen with care, and then glanced away with a softness that was worse than a sneer, because a sneer at least acknowledged you as an opponent. This was the gentleness one extended to the help. She did not know the codes. That was the whole of her disadvantage, laid bare in the first 90 seconds. She did not know that the fan a matron held closed against her collarbone meant I am not receiving, or that the young men gathered at the east windows had arranged themselves by precedent so exact that to misjudge it and address the wrong one, first was a small social death. She did not know that her own hands, clasped before her, were holding themselves in a posture that announced anxious supplicant to every person in the room fluent enough to read it. She knew arithmancy and statute law and the precise heat at which a polyjuice base must be held, and none of it was the slightest use to her here. And then the current shifted, and she understood that he had come in. she did not turn. She refused, on principle, to be one of the heads that turned. But she felt the gravity of it, the way the room's attention reorganized itself, the way the dove-grey woman's spine lengthened a half-inch, the way a path seemed to clear without anyone visibly stepping aside. She kept her eyes on their orchestra, on the cellist's bow drawing its long amber note, and she let the awareness of him arrive the way you let cold water find you in a still lake. Slowly, from the feet up. Draco Malfoy, at the center of his own world, was a different creature from the boy she had hated. She had known that already, had seen him twice since the trials, both times across a courtroom, both times grey and contained and giving nothing. But here he was, upholstered in the thing he had been bred for, and it fit him the way a sword fits a scabbard forged around it. The black coat, the signet on his right hand catching candlelight, the particular stillness of a man who has never in his life had to wonder whether a room would make space for him. He had not seen her yet. She had a few seconds, and she used them to be honest with herself in the cold, surgical way she was capable of when no one could watch her do it. He is beautiful, and it costs him nothing, and I despise how easily it costs him nothing. Then he saw her. It was not dramatic. That was what undid her composure. She had braced for contempt, for the curl of the lip, for some performance of distaste she could meet with armor of her own. Instead, his gaze found her across the bright floor and simply stopped, the way a man stops when he has walked into a room and found a window where he expected a wall. For one full breath, he did not arrange his face. She saw, before the shutter came down, something that was not contempt and not welcome and not anything she had a word for, a flicker of pure, naked surprise, and underneath it, gone almost before it surfaced, something that might have been the question, "Why are you here?" and might have been the much worse question, "Why does it matter to me that you are?" Then the shutter came down. His expression smoothed into the courteous nothing of his class, and he inclined his head, a fraction, the precise fraction she would later understand, that one offered to an acquaintance of ambiguous standing, and turned to greet the people whose duty it was to greet him. The whole exchange had lasted perhaps 3 seconds. No one else had marked it. And Hermione stood very still and felt her pulse going hard in her wrists, and was furious, genuinely, righteously furious, that her body had decided to react to a man across a room before her mind had been consulted in the matter at all. "You're holding your fan like a market-day fishwife," said a voice at her shoulder, low and amused, and entirely without cruelty, which made it somehow worse. Hermione turned. The woman beside her was small and dark and exquisitely poised, draped in a green so deep it read black until it moved. And Hermione knew her on sight, though they had never been introduced, knew the sharp, clever face and the heavy-lidded eyes that missed nothing. "I wasn't aware I was holding it at all," Hermione said. "No," Pansy Parkinson agreed pleasantly. "That's the trouble, isn't it?" She let her gaze travel down Hermione once, unhurried, cataloguing the gown, the unornamented throat, the hands. And there was no hatred in it. That was the masterstroke. Hatred would have been a kind of equality. This was the patient, faintly sorrowful assessment one gives a creature that has wandered somewhere it cannot survive. "I did wonder whether they'd send someone." I confess I expected a clerk with spectacles and a clipboard, not a small gesture encompassing all of Hermione. This, the war heroine, how very modern of the ministry. I'm only here to observe. Of course you are. Pansy's smile was warm and genuine and devastating. We all observe the first night. Then we learn that in this room there is no such thing as merely watching. Every gesture is a sentence, Miss Granger. You've been speaking since you walked in, and I'm afraid you've been saying things you'd never choose to say aloud. She tilted her head, and the candlelight ran along the line of her jaw. Hold your fan a finger's width lower and angle the spine toward the floor. There. Now you've stopped announcing that you're afraid. Hermione looked at her. Why would you help me? And here Pansy's expression changed, not to malice, but to something more honest, a flash of the steel beneath the silk, gone as fast as Draco's surprise had been. Because I'd rather win against someone who can stand up, she said simply, than watch you lose to a room. There's no glory in beating a woman who doesn't even know she's in a fight. She drew a slow breath, and her gaze flicked just once across the floor to where the pale head bent over a matron's hand and came back. And you are in a fight, Miss Granger. You felt that just now. I watched you feel it. You think you came here to read documents and report back, and perhaps that's even true. But this season ends in a choice, and there is exactly one choice in this room that matters, and you have already, without meaning to, without wanting to, put your hand on the scale. I haven't the faintest idea what you mean, Hermione said, and the lie was so transparent that Pansy did not even bother to acknowledge it. You will, she said. I'll make you a promise, since we're being frank, and we won't be frank again after tonight. After tonight, we'll be very, very polite, you and I, and you'll learn to hate how polite I can be. She closed her own fan with a single fluid motion, a sound like a small door shutting. I have wanted exactly one thing since I was 9 years old. I have ordered my entire life around the having of it. I know every rule of this room because I will need every one of them. And you. The smile again, warm as a hearth, cold as the grave. You don't even know what you want yet. That's your only advantage and your only danger. By the time you work it out, I intend for it to be far too late. Across the room, the orchestra drew to the end of its figure, and in the brief hush before the next, Hermione felt rather than saw Draco Malfoy turn his head and look at the two of them standing together, the woman who belonged and the woman who did not, side by side at the edge of his world. And she watched his composure hold and his hand, the one bearing the signet, close slowly into a fist at his side. The library at Malfoy Manor was not part of the season, which was precisely why Hermione had gone looking for it. She had learned, in the 3 weeks since that first night, that the ritual ran on a calendar as exact and unforgiving as a tide table. There were the great balls, where everything was visible, and therefore nothing real could happen. There were the morning calls, 15 minutes long to the second, cards left on silver trays, a vocabulary of folded corners she had memorized the way she had once memorized the 12 uses of dragon's blood. And there were the country visits, 3 days, sometimes 4, the courting houses opening their doors to the eligible and their watchful relations, the whole machine grinding forward beneath the cover of hospitality. This was one of those. She had been invited because the ministry's writ compelled it, and because, she suspected, someone with a sense of irony enjoyed the spectacle of Hermione Granger sleeping under this particular roof. She had not slept. That was why she was in the library at 1:30 in the morning, in a dressing gown over her nightdress, hunting a book to dull her mind into surrender, and why she had not expected the fire to be lit, or the figure in the chair before it, or the way the whole architecture of her composure came down at the sight of him like a tower of cards meeting a draught. Draco did not startle. He had heard her, she realized, had heard her from the moment the door breathed open, and had simply chosen not to perform surprise. He was sitting low in a wing-backed chair of cracked oxblood leather, with a glass of something amber held loose in his fingers, the signet ring throwing back the firelight, and he did not look up at her, so much as let his eyes rise to her by degrees, unhurried, the way a man looks at weather he has already decided he cannot change. "Miss Granger," he said, "the house is large enough that I'd assumed we could avoid each other in it. I see I overestimated the architecture. I was looking for a book. There are a great many. Take one and go." But he did not look away, and he did not mean it, and they both heard that he did not mean it, and the silence after the words was the loudest thing in the room. She should have gone. She knew, with the clear, cold part of her mind that never stopped narrating her own behavior to her, that the correct and sensible and self-protective thing was to lift a volume from the nearest shelf and retreat. Instead, she crossed the room toward the warmth, toward him, though she told herself it was toward the fire, and stood with her hands held to the flames, and felt the heat work into her cold fingers, and said, because she could not help it, because the question had been climbing her throat for 3 weeks, "Why are you doing it?" Doing what? This, the season, the whole grotesque pageant of it. You sat through your own trial, Malfoy. You watched what that world did to itself and to everyone underneath it. And now you're letting them parade you like a prize bull at a country fair so the old families can, what? Breed the blood back together before it thins. You can't possibly believe in it. The fire spat. He turned the glass a slow half-circle in his fingers, watching the amber climb the side of it, and for a long moment she thought he would not answer at all, that the shutter she had watched come down over his face that first night would simply lower again, and she would be standing here in her dressing gown, having said too much to a man who would give her nothing back. "Belief," he said finally, "is a luxury for people who have a choice about what they are." He said it without heat, without the melodrama she had braced for, in the flat voice of a man stating a tedious fact. "My father is alive on sufferance. My mother goes to the village, and the women she has known for 40 years cross to the other side of the lane. The name is the only thing the war left me that has any weight at all, and a name is a debt as much as it is a possession. So, I pay it. I stand in the rooms, and I let them look, and I will, at the end of all this, do the thing the name requires of me, because the alternative is to let the last of it rot into the ground, and there are people I—" He stopped. She waited. "There are people who would be buried under that," he finished, and turned his face back to the fire, and his jaw was a hard, pale line in the firelight, and his free hand had closed slowly against the arm of the chair until the tendons stood up across the back of it. He had not said, "I deserve it." He had not made a single one of the speeches she had expected. The lavish, wallowing self-blame she realized with a small shock, have found easier to bear than this, because contempt for himself she could have argued with. And this was not contempt. This was a man who had done the arithmetic of his own life and was paying the sum without complaint, because complaining would not lower the figure. "And Parkinson is the answer the name requires," she said. His mouth did something complicated. "Pansy has wanted this since we were children. She'd tell you so herself. She's told half the room. She knows the steps. She knows the rooms. She would be—" He searched for the word with visible distaste at his own fluency in this language. Correct. She would make no mistakes. There would be no scandal and no surprise, and no one would ever have to wonder whether the heir of Malfoy had married beneath the salt. You make it sound like a sentence. Everything in this room is a sentence, Granger. He looked up at her then, fully, and the firelight caught his eyes and made them silver, and there was something in them she had no defense prepared for, because it was not the cruelty of their childhood, and it was not the careful nothing of the courtroom. It was a kind of exhausted, furious honesty, the honesty of a man at 1:30 in the morning, with a glass in his hand and nothing left to guard against. Pansy told you that, didn't she? The first night, I saw her tell you something. Whatever it was, she was right. She usually is about this. It's the only subject she's ever cared enough to be right about. She told me I'd already put my hand on the scale, Hermione said, without meaning to. The words dropped into the quiet and changed the temperature of it. He went very still. Outside the tall windows, a wind had come up off the grounds, and the first fat drops of a winter rain began to strike the glass. Slow at first, then quickening, until the whole high room was wrapped in the rush and patter of it, the fire hissing where a drop found the chimney, the candlelight trembling. The air between them seemed to draw tight, the way the air draws tight before a hex, a charge gathering with nowhere to go. She was aware of the small distance between his chair and where she stood. She was aware that she had not moved away from it. She was aware of the ridiculous, mortifying fact that her own pulse had begun to knock against her throat, and she lifted her chin against it, because she would be damned before she let this room and this man make a coward of her body when her mind had not consented. "And had you?" he asked, very quietly. "Put your hand on the scale." "I don't know what the scale is." "That's not what I asked. I came here to write a report, Malfoy." But her voice did not have the iron she wanted in it, and the firelit silence after the rain swallowed the rest of whatever conviction she might have summoned. "I know why you came." He set the glass down on the small table at his elbow with a click that was loud in the hush, and he leaned forward in the chair, elbows on his knees, and now there was less than a body's length between them, and the heat of the fire was at her back, and the heat of him was— She would not name what it was in front of her, and she did not step away. "I've read your reports, the ones you filed. Dry, correct, devastating, actually. You've quietly built a case that this whole revival is a vehicle for reconsolidating old blood capital and political influence under cover of tea and dancing. And you're entirely right. And when you file the last of them, you'll do real damage to people who deserve it. His mouth twisted. And not once, in any of it, have you written a single word about the fact that you can't stop coming, that you keep finding reasons, that you went looking for a book at 1:30 in the morning in a house where you watched my aunt try to peel you open on the floor of the next room down. The rain hammered the glass. A log shifted in the grate and sent up a soft fountain of sparks, and in the flare of it, she saw his face entirely, all the careful architecture of it down, and what was underneath was not triumph at having caught her out. It was something closer to fear, the particular fear of a man who has just said a true thing aloud and cannot take it back, who has shown a card he has been holding so long that the holding had become the whole of his strategy. "Don't," she said. It came out barely above the rain. "Don't what? Don't do that. Don't see me. You don't get to do that. You spent 6 years not seeing me, and your family spent one afternoon." Her voice cracked, and she despised it for cracking. "In this house, doing what it did, and now you sit in a chair with a glass of fire whiskey, and you presume to tell me why I can't stop coming, as though you know the inside of my own. I don't presume to know anything." He was on his feet now. She had not seen him rise, but he was up and close, and the firelight ran the length of him, and his voice had dropped to something low and urgent that she felt in her sternum more than heard. "That's the entire trouble, Granger. I don't know anything. I have spent 5 years knowing exactly what I am, and exactly what is owed, and exactly what the end of this winter requires of me. And then you walked into that ballroom in a blue gown holding your fan like a fishwife, and every certainty I own began to—" He stopped himself. His hand had come up between them, not to touch her, she would understand later. He had not been reaching for her. His hand had simply risen of its own accord into the small, charged space between their bodies, as though to ward off the next word, or to hold it in. And it hung there now, the signet ring catching the light, close enough that she could feel the warmth coming off his palm against her cheek without a single point of contact between his skin and hers. Neither of them moved. The rain came down in sheets against the black glass, and the fire burned low and gold, and the whole vast house held its breath around them, and Hermione looked at the hand that had stopped a half-inch from her face, and understood that everything in her life had narrowed to the question of whether it would close that distance or fall away. And then, from the corridor, the unmistakable sound of a door and footsteps and Pansy Parkinson's voice, light, carrying, deliberately loud enough to be heard well in advance, calling out something pleasant about a draft and a missing book, and Draco's hand dropped to his side as though it had been struck, and the shutter came down over his face so fast and so complete that Hermione might have dreamed everything beneath it, and he stepped back into the shadow beyond the fire, and was once more only the heir of the house, correct and contained and giving nothing, by the time the library door swung wide and Pansy came smiling into the light. Pansy had a gift, and the gift was this. She could see a thing entire in a single glance, and choose in the same instant exactly how much of her seeing to let show. She saw it now. Hermione watched her see it. The low fire, the two glasses where there should have been one, the particular distance between the heir of the house and the ministry's observer, a distance just slightly too careful, too freshly arranged. The distance of two people who had been standing much closer a heartbeat before. She saw Hermione's bare throat and loose hair and the dressing gown, and she saw Draco already withdrawn into the shadow at the chimney's edge with his face smoothed to courtesy, and she read the whole of it the way Hermione might read a balance sheet, in one cool downward sweep of the eyes. And she smiled and said, "There you are. I told Theo someone had stolen the only decent fire in the house and kept it for themselves. Selfish Draco. Some of us feel the cold." She crossed the room as though she had every right to it, which she did, gathering the warmth around herself, holding her pale hands to the flames beside Hermione's, and the gesture placed them deliberately side by side again, the way they had stood that first night, so that the firelight fell on both their faces at once and invited comparison. "Miss Granger, insomnia. It takes everyone the first country visit. The beds are very old, and the ghosts are very busy." "I was looking for a book," Hermione said, for the second time that night, and heard how thin it sounded. "Were you?" Pansy's eyes moved unhurried to the shelves, to the unmarked rows where Hermione had not in fact taken down a single volume, and then back, and she let the lie sit there between them, unchallenged, which was worse than challenging it. "You must let me show you the collection properly, in daylight. There are things in here that aren't in the Hogwarts library, things the old houses keep close. Draco's grandfather collected dueling treatises. Hermione would like those, wouldn't she, Draco? She's a great one for a fight." She said the name, Hermione, with a soft, proprietary ease, the ease of a woman demonstrating that she could be generous, that she could afford to be, that intimacy with the enemy cost her nothing because the outcome was already written. "It's late," Draco said from the shadow. Granger was leaving. "Was she? Don't let me drive you out." But Pansy had already won the small war of the room, and they all knew it. She had not raised her voice or shown a single claw, and yet Hermione found herself moving toward the door, a book seized half-blind from the nearest shelf to make the lie true, her face hot, her composure in ruins, while Pansy settled into the oxblood chair that Draco had vacated, as though sliding into a place that had been kept warm for her precisely. "Good night, Miss Granger," she called, light and warm and final. "Do sleep. You look as though you need it." Hermione did not sleep. She lay in a four-poster older than the ministry itself, in a room where the rain had not stopped, and she held the stolen book against her chest without opening it. It was, she discovered, when grey light finally came, a treatise on the breeding of show-neasels, which felt like a judgment. And she conducted, in the dark, the interrogation of herself that she had been refusing to conduct for 3 weeks. You felt his hand a half-inch from your face, and you did not move. That was the fact. That was the whole intolerable fact of it. And her mind, which could dismantle a statute or a potion or an opponent's argument into its component lies, turned the fact over and over and found no way to make it harmless. She had not moved. She had stood in a house that had hurt her, in front of a man whose family had hurt her, and her body had wanted his hand to close that distance with a force that frightened her more than the manor ever had. And the only thing that had saved her from learning what she would have done was the sound of a door. She was honest, at least. It was the one virtue she would always allow herself. So she lay in the dark and did not pretend that what she felt was professional concern or pity or the residue of an old hatred curdled into something stranger. She named it because she had promised herself a long time ago that she would always rather know a hard thing than be comforted by a false one. You want him. You, Hermione Granger, want Draco Malfoy, and you have wanted him for some time. And tonight, he very nearly let you see that he wants you back. And a woman who has trained her whole life for this saw it too. And now everything is going to become much more difficult. She was right about that. It began with the cards. She did not understand at first why the invitations changed. For 3 weeks she had received the bare minimum the writ required, the great balls, where her presence could not be refused, and nothing else. Now, suddenly, she was included. A morning salon at the Greengrass townhouse, a musical evening at the Knots, a hunt breakfast she had no idea how to comport herself at. The cards arrived on the silver tray with their corners folded in ways she could not read, and she sat with them spread before her like a hand of cards in a game whose rules she did not know, and she understood only that the gate had been opened, and that an opened gate is not always a kindness. It was Pansy, of course. It took her 4 days to be sure, but it was Pansy. "She's letting you in," said Daphne Greengrass, who was the nearest thing Hermione had found to an ally, a cool, watchful woman who had married out of the old world and back into it, and seemed to find the whole machine faintly absurd. They were standing at the edge of the Greengrass salon, and Daphne was watching Pansy hold court across the room, luminous in claret silk, 3 young men bent toward her like plants toward a window. "You realize that? You weren't invited to any of this a week ago. Now the doors are open. That's Pansy." Why would she open doors for me? Daphne looked at her with something close to pity. Because she can't beat you in the dark, where you've got the war heroine's glamour and the mystery of the outsider, and 1,000 people quietly rooting for the girl who doesn't fit. So she's bringing you into the light. She took a sip of her wine. In here, where she knows every step and you know none, she'll let you fail in front of everyone, slowly, in 100 small ways you won't even see coming, until the whole room agrees, kindly, regretfully, certainly, that you simply don't belong. She's not going to fight you, Hermione. She's going to host you. It's much crueler. And there's nothing in the world you can do about it, because the moment you refuse the invitations, you've conceded that you're afraid of the room, and you'll have lost anyway. Across the salon, Pansy caught Hermione's eye and lifted her glass a fraction, a toast, warm and public, and utterly without malice that anyone could point to. And Hermione understood that the season had truly begun, and that she had been outmaneuvered before she had grasped that there was a board. And Draco watched. That was the thread that ran beneath all of it, the thing that kept Hermione from simply filing her report and fleeing the field entirely, the thing she despised in herself, even as she could not stop her eyes from seeking it. Draco watched. Through every salon and every breakfast and every interminable evening of music, while Pansy steered Hermione gently into one small humiliation after another. The wrong fork, the wrong form of address, the dance she did not know she had accepted by failing to refuse it correctly. Draco stood at the edges of rooms with a glass in his hand and a stillness on him, and his eyes moved between the two women as though between two readings of the same line, and gave nothing away, and missed nothing. She caught him at it once, fully, unmistakably. It was at the Knots musical evening, and a baritone was murdering an old wizarding ballad, and Pansy had just performed a small, flawless cruelty, drawing Hermione into a conversation about a custom Hermione couldn't possibly know, then rescuing her from it with a generosity that made the whole table aware of the rescue. And Hermione had sat with her wine and her humiliation and lifted her eyes and found Draco across the room already looking at her. He did not look away. That was the thing. A guilty man looks away. A courteous man looks away. Draco held her gaze across the candlelit room over the wreckage of the baritone's high note, and there was no triumph in it, and no pity in it, only a kind of grave attention, the attention of a man reading something he had decided to read all the way to the end, no matter the cost. And then, so slightly that she might have invented it, he shook his head, once, a fraction, and she understood it as clearly as if he had crossed the room and spoken. Don't let her. You're better than this room. Don't let her make you small. It should have helped. Instead, it undid her, because it meant he was watching closely enough to know exactly what was being done to her, and choosing, for reasons of name and debt, and the whole machinery of obligation he had laid out for her in the firelight, to do nothing to stop it. That was the night she stopped trying to play the game. She decided it on the carriage ride back, in the dark, with the rain on the roof and the lamps swinging, and the decision settled into her with the cold, clean finality of all her best decisions. She would not learn the codes. She would not fold her cards correctly, or hold her fan a finger's width lower, or master the 11 forms of address. She would lose every one of those small wars, because they were not her wars, and never could be, and the trying only made her smaller. She would do, instead, the one thing no one in that gilded world had thought to defend against, because it had never once been used as a weapon in those rooms in living memory. She would tell the truth. The opportunity came sooner than she expected, and in a worse place than she would have chosen, and it began, as these things had begun to do, with Pansy, who found Hermione alone on the Knots terrace the following week, taking the cold air to clear a headache the music had given her, and who came to stand beside her at the stone balustrade, with the frost-stiff garden falling away below them, and the windows of the great house spilling gold across the lawn, and who said, without any preamble at all, in a voice stripped suddenly of every performance Hermione had yet seen her give, "You should go home, Hermione, truly. Not because I want you gone, though I do, but because you're going to be hurt here, badly, and you don't even see the shape of it coming, and for some reason I can't account for, I find I don't entirely want to watch it happen." And the genuine thing in her voice, the crack of something real beneath the silk, was the most frightening weapon she had used yet. The frost had settled on the balustrade in a fine white nap, and where Hermione's bare hand rested against the stone, it had begun to ache with the cold, and she did not move it because the pain of it was clarifying, and she needed to be clear. "Don't do that," she said. "Do what?" Pansy's breath plumed silver in the lamplight. Below them, the formal garden lay rigid under its rime, the box hedges gone grey-white and brittle, a stone fountain frozen mid-fall into a snarl of ice. That, the honesty, you've used everything else on me. The kindness, the lessons, the doors, the toasts. You've been the most gracious enemy I've ever had. And now you've found that none of it has driven me off. So you've reached for the one thing you hadn't tried, which is to sound as though you mean it. Hermione turned to face her fully, and the cold had stripped something away from her too, some last layer of the deference she'd been wearing like an ill-fitting coat for a month. "I almost admire it. It's very nearly perfect. The only flaw is that I do the same thing, Parkinson, except I'm not performing it. So I know exactly what it looks like from the inside, and I can tell when it's being put on." For a moment, Pansy said nothing. The music from the house had stopped. In the gap between figures, the only sound was the small tick of the frost settling, and a far-off owl somewhere over the black line of the trees. Then Pansy laughed, a short, genuine, astonished sound, nothing like the silvery instrument she used in the salons. "God," she said, "you really are clever. Everyone says it, and you assume it's a euphemism for tiresome, but you actually are." She turned and set both forearms on the frozen balustrade, careless of her silk, and looked out over the dead garden. And when she spoke again, the performance had, in fact, fallen entirely away, and what was underneath was harder and plainer and much more dangerous. "Fine. No more lessons. You want the truth from me? I'll give it to you, and it'll be the last truth either of us tells the other. So listen well. I wasn't lying. I do, against every instinct I possess, find that I don't want to watch you broken in those rooms. And I am also going to break you in those rooms if you make me, without hesitating, because I have wanted that man since before either of us understood what wanting was, and I will not lose him to a woman who isn't even sure she's playing. I'm not playing. No." Pansy's eyes cut sideways. "You're worse. You're feeling. I could fight a player. A player makes moves, and moves can be answered. You don't make moves. You just exist in his eyeline, in a blue gown, being precisely everything he's been taught to despise, and has somehow never managed to. And he watches you the way he's never watched anything in his life. And there's no countermove for that, Granger, because it isn't strategy, it's gravity, and you can't outmaneuver a thing that doesn't know it's pulling." Her knuckles, Hermione saw, had gone white where they gripped the stone, the one tell breaking through the surface of all that control. "Do you have any idea what I've built? 20 years. I learned the rooms, the rules, the families, the histories, the precise angle of every fan in England, so that when this season came, and we always knew it would come, the old houses can't help themselves. I would be ready. I would be correct. I would be the answer to every question the name could ask. I made myself into the perfect solution to his problem. And then you walked in and reminded him that he might have wanted instead to not have the problem at all." Hermione's chest had gone tight. "Pansy, he told you about the debt." It was not a question. In the library, the name, the mother, the village women crossing the lane. He gave you the whole speech, the one where he's noble and doomed and paying for his sins by marrying correctly. He's never told me that speech. Did you know that? 5 years, and he's never once said it to me, because to me it isn't a confession. It's just Tuesday. It's the air we both breathe. It doesn't need saying. But he said it to you, because to you it's strange, and a man only explains himself to the person he's afraid won't understand and desperately needs to anyway. She straightened off the balustrade and brushed the frost from her arms with 2 sharp strokes, and her composure came back over her like a tide returning, but slower this time, and Hermione had seen the seafloor beneath it and could not unsee it. That's how I know. Not the looks. Looks are nothing. Men look. It's that he talks to you. Draco Malfoy, who has not said a true thing aloud to a living soul since he was 16 years old, sat in a chair at 1 a.m. and told you the truth. That's the thing I can't fight, and the thing I will fight anyway, because what else is there for me to do? Go home. I have no home that isn't this. You can leave. You have a whole life out there, a career, a name they cheer in the street. This is the only life I was ever made for. So, no, Hermione, I won't go gently. But I wanted you to know, before the worst of it starts, that when I hurt you, and I will, it won't be because I think you're nothing. It'll be because I think you're everything, and I cannot afford for that to be true. She was gone before Hermione could answer, back through the tall doors into the gold and the music, leaving Hermione alone on the terrace with the frozen fountain and the ache in her hand, and the terrible new knowledge that her rival was not a villain, but a woman drowning, fighting for the only shore she had ever been allowed to swim toward. It would have been easier if Pansy had been cruel. Hermione understood that as she stood there in the cold. A cruel woman she could have fought without flinching. This was so much worse. To want a thing another person needed more, and to know it, and to be unable to make herself stop wanting it anyway. The door opened again behind her, and she did not turn, because she assumed it was a servant or a stranger seeking the air. And so, the voice, when it came, struck her the harder for being unexpected. "You're going to freeze out here," Draco said. She turned. He stood a few feet away with his coat already off and held out in one hand a plain dark thing, no ornament. And he did not advance to drape it over her shoulders, which would have been the gesture from a romance, but simply held it out, leaving her the choice, leaving her the distance. The lamplight was behind him, and she could not read his face. "I'm well enough," she said. "You're shaking." He took one step and laid the coat across the balustrade beside her, close enough to reach, and then stepped back again to his careful distance. And she understood that he had constructed even this, a kindness done at arm's length, an offering that cost her nothing to refuse, and that the construction was itself a kind of tenderness, the only kind a man so heavily guarded knew how to extend. She was out here a long time. Pansy, you were watching. I'm always watching. You've noticed. You say so with your whole face every time you catch me at it. The ghost of something that might once have grown into a smile touched the corner of his mouth and died there. What did she tell you? That she'll break me if I make her. She will. He said it without flinching. She's not lying about that. She's the most dangerous person in any room she enters, and she's better than all of them, and she spent her whole life loading every weapon she owns for exactly this winter. A pause. The owl called again, nearer now. What else did she say? There was more. You've gone very still, and you only go still like that when something's gone in past your defenses. Hermione picked up the coat. She had not meant to. Her cold hands made the decision before her pride could veto it, and she pulled the heavy, dark wool around her shoulders, and it smelled of him, of cedar and cold air, and something underneath that was only warmth, only skin. And the scent went through her like a hex finding bone, and she had to hold very still herself for a moment before she trusted her voice. She said, "You talk to me," Hermione said. That you've never told her the things you've told me, that it's the one thing she can't fight. The silence that followed was different from all the silences that had come before it. The other silences had been guarded or charged or careful. This one was simply true, a silence with nothing held back inside it, the silence of a man who has been handed a fact about himself by way of a third party, and finds it is more accurate than anything he would have dared say on his own behalf. She watched him absorb it. She watched the line of his shoulders change. He looked, for one moment, profoundly tired and profoundly young, and entirely without the armor she had only ever seen him wear. "She's right," he said at last, very low. "I don't know why. I've thought about it. I've lain awake doing the arithmetic of it, the way I do everything, trying to work out the mechanism, and I can't. You're the last person I should be able to speak to. You're the ministry's knife at my family's throat. You're the witness to the worst afternoon of both our lives. There is no version of my life in which talking to you is anything but a catastrophe." He stopped. His hand had come up to grip the frozen balustrade, and the cold of the stone did not seem to reach him at all. "And I cannot stop doing it. I walk into a room and I find you before I've decided to look. I save up things to say to you. Do you understand how—" His voice roughened, and he pressed it flat again by main force. "How humiliating that is for a man like me to discover that he has been saving up things to say to a woman like you, as though I was 16, as though there were a single thing in my life I was permitted to want for no reason but that I wanted it. Draco, don't." He shook his head, and the old shutter began to descend, and she watched him reach for it the way a drowning man reaches for wood. "Don't say my name like that. You don't. There's a way you say it. Did you know? You say it like it's a word and not a sentence, like it's only a name and not a whole inheritance of debt. And when you do it, I forget for a moment that it's anything else, and I cannot afford to forget. There are people who'll be buried if I forget." He stepped back. The distance reassembled itself between them, deliberate, final. "Keep the coat. Send it back tomorrow. And Granger." He was at the door now, one hand on the cold brass, his face half lost again to the lamplight. "She told you she'd break you because you're everything. She tells the truth more than people think. So do I, apparently, only to you. Take that for whatever it's worth on a freezing terrace at the wrong end of a season neither of us can win." And he was gone into the gold and the music, and Hermione stood wrapped in the warmth of a coat that smelled of him, holding the unbearable new weight of having been wanted plainly, out loud, by a man walking away from her as fast as his own honour could carry him. The Yule Ball at Knott Manor was the centre of the season, the great hinge on which the whole winter turned. And Hermione understood, walking into it, that whatever was going to happen to her would happen here. She had dressed for war. That was the only way she could think of it. She had refused, in the end, to compete on Pansy's ground. Refused the elaborate confections the other women wore, the silver-threaded silks and the heirloom diamonds, the whole armoury of belonging she could never have matched, and would only have been diminished by attempting. Instead, she had gone to a Muggle dressmaker in a part of London no one in these rooms would ever set foot in, and she had ordered a gown of deep crimson, so plain it was almost severe. No ornament, no jewels, nothing but the colour and the cut and her own bare throat. And she wore her hair down, and she carried no fan at all, because she had decided that she would rather be visibly, defiantly without the language, than fumble it one more time in front of a room that was waiting for exactly that. The effect, when she entered, was not what she had braced for. She had expected the soft, dismissive glances, the current flowing around her. Instead, the murmur paused. For her. For the first time in the whole long winter, the room gathered its attention and turned it on her. And she stood in the doorway in plain red, with her chin up, and understood, with a small shock, that by refusing to play, she had accidentally done the one thing the rooms respected above all others. She had looked as though she did not care what they thought. It was the only currency she had ever possessed in unlimited supply, and she had spent a month forgetting she had it. She found Draco before she had decided to look. Pansy had been right about that too. It was automatic now, a compass needle swinging north. He was standing near the great hearth in black, and Pansy was beside him in silver. Of course, in silver, the Malfoy colour, a flag planted in advance. And they made, the two of them, exactly the photograph the entire season had been arranged to produce. The heir and his correct answer. Hermione looked at them and felt the old cold clarity settle over her, and she did not look away. And across the brilliant room, Draco's eyes lifted and found her in her plain red gown, and his face did the thing it had done on the very first night. It forgot, for one unguarded instant, to be anything at all. Pansy saw it. Pansy saw everything, and Hermione watched the last of the gentleness go out of her like a candle pinched between two fingers. The strike came an hour later, and it was beautiful, and it was merciless, and Hermione never saw the shape of it until it had already closed. It began with the dancing. There was a particular figure danced at these balls, old, formal, a thing of patterns and exchanges, partners passing down a line. And Hermione had watched it a dozen times that winter and never once been drawn into it, because to be drawn into it, you had to be asked in the correct form, and no one had asked her in any form at all. Now, suddenly, she was asked. A young man she half knew, a not cousin, bowed before her with the exact phrase, and the whole room saw it, and she could not refuse without insult. And so she rose and took her place in the line, and Pansy, luminous, gracious, queen of the floor, arranged for the figure to deliver Hermione, at its turning, into the very centre, alone, exposed, with a step she could not possibly know, because it was a step that the daughters of the old houses learned at 6, and that existed nowhere in any book. Hermione stood in the center of the figure with 200 people watching, and did not know what to do with her hands. It lasted perhaps 4 seconds. 4 seconds of the music turning, and the dancers waiting, and Hermione's body refusing to produce a movement it had never been taught. 4 seconds of the room beginning, kindly, regretfully, certainly, to understand what it was seeing, which was the war heroine exposed at last as exactly the outsider they had always known her to be, undone not by cruelty, but by a single dance step in front of everyone, completely. She felt the heat climb her throat. She felt her own hands begin their frantic, traitorous search for something to do, reaching to straighten a cuff that did not need straightening, and she stopped them by sheer will, and stood, and burned, and across the floor she saw Pansy, watching with an expression of perfect, sorrowful sympathy that was the cruelest thing Hermione had ever seen on a human face, because it was indistinguishable from kindness and meant the precise opposite. And then Draco crossed the floor. He did it wrong. That was the thing the room understood before Hermione did. He did not wait for the figure. He did not take his correct place. He walked through the pattern of the dance, breaking it, scattering the careful geometry of partners and lines, and the music faltered as the players lost the thread, and he came to the center where Hermione stood exposed, and he stopped in front of her and held out his hand. It was not a step in any figure. It was not anything the rooms had a word for. It was a man abandoning the entire architecture of his world, in public, in front of every person whose good opinion that world had taught him to need, to stand beside the woman it had been arranged to humiliate. "Dance with me," he said, quietly, just to her, but the room was so silent now that it carried. "I don't know the steps," Hermione said. Her voice shook and she let it. "I know." His hands stayed out, steady, the signet catching the candlelight. "So we'll do it badly, together, in front of all of them. It's the only kind of dancing I've ever actually wanted to do." And there was something in his face that was not the air of Malfoy, and not the courtroom ghost, and not the careful man on the freezing terrace. It was something open and reckless and entirely undefended. A man who had finished, at last, doing the arithmetic and arrived at the only answer that had ever mattered and decided to pay whatever it cost. She put her hand in his. The contact went through her like the snap of static before a storm. His palm warm and dry, the cold band of the ring against her fingers, his hand closing over hers with a care that was almost unbearable. And he drew her in, not into the figure, not into any pattern the room could read, but into a slow, plain turning that belonged to no tradition at all. His hand at her waist, her hand on his shoulder, the two of them moving in the wreckage of the broken dance, while the players, after a long stunned moment, found a tune to fit and began, hesitantly, to play it. He held her too close for propriety, and not close enough for what was in both their faces, and he looked down at her the whole time, and he did not once look away to see what the room was doing, which was the most extraordinary thing of all, that a man so trained to watch the room had simply, finally stopped. "You've ruined yourself," she said, low against the small space between them. Do you understand what you've just done? You've stood up in front of every name in England and chosen the ministry's knife. There's no undoing this, Draco. The debt, the name, your mother, the village. I know exactly what I've done. His voice was very steady and very quiet, and only for her. I did the arithmetic. I've been doing it for a month. I did it standing by that hearth watching you walk in looking like the only true thing in a room full of expensive lies. And I worked the whole sum through one final time. And do you know what I found? His hand tightened at her waist, drawing her a fraction closer, and the turning of the dance carried them through the candlelight and the silence and the 200 staring faces as though none of them existed. I found that I'd been solving the wrong problem, the whole of it, the name, the debt, the duty. I'd been so busy working out how to pay what I owed the dead that I never once asked what I owed the living, what I owed myself. And the answer to that sum, Granger, the answer I've been refusing to write down for 5 years because I didn't think a man like me was allowed to have one. The answer is you. It's been you since the first night. It'll be you when every door in this country has shut in my face. I've spent my whole life being correct, and I would rather be ruined with you than correct with anyone else alive. She could not speak. The room had begun, somewhere at its edges, to murmur. A different murmur than any she had heard that winter, scandalized and electric and alive. And she did not care, and neither did he. And they turned slowly in the center of the broken figure while the music tried to catch up. And she looked up at him and saw the whole of it written plain in his face. The thing he had hidden behind the shutter for a month. The thing Pansy had told her she could not fight because it was gravity and not strategy. And Hermione understood that it was true, and that it had always been true, and that the turning floor and the staring faces and the silver flag of Pansy's gown across the room had all been arranged to prevent precisely this, and had failed. And then, over Draco's shoulder, she saw Pansy. The other woman stood at the edge of the floor where the dancers had scattered, alone now, the silver of her gown catching the light. And she was not weeping, and she was not raging. She was simply standing very still, with her chin up and her hands folded before her with terrible composure, watching the man she had built her entire life around hold another woman in the wreckage of a dance she herself had choreographed to destroy that very woman. Her face had gone white and perfectly smooth, the way water goes smooth over something drowned, and only her knuckles betrayed her, bone pale where her fingers gripped each other. And Hermione, even in the center of the most extraordinary moment of her life, even with Draco's hand warm at her waist and his confession still ringing in her ears, felt her heart break for her, because she knew now exactly what it had cost to build the thing that had just come down, and exactly how little of a life was left standing on the other side of it. The music swelled. Draco's hand pressed warm against the small of her back, drawing her up out of the turn and close, closer, his face lowering toward hers in front of all of England. And Hermione's eyes slid shut, and in the breath before his mouth could find hers, she heard, clear and carrying across the suddenly silent ballroom, Pansy Parkinson's voice, steady, ringing, pitched for the entire room to hear, say a single sentence that stopped Draco's lips a hair's breadth from her own and turned every head in the hall. The wardship of Malfoy is invoked. The words fell into the silence like stones into a frozen pond, and Hermione felt Draco go rigid against her, every line of him locking, his breath stopping in his chest. And she opened her eyes to find the whole ballroom transformed, the murmur dead. 200 faces turned not toward the broken dance now, but toward Pansy, who stood alone in her silver at the edge of the floor with her chin lifted, and her ruin held so beautifully in check that it looked, to anyone who did not know, like triumph. Pansy! Draco's voice came out low and dangerous, and his hand had not left Hermione's waist, but his whole body had turned toward the threat. Don't! It's done. I've said it. It's witnessed. Her gaze swept the room. The elders by the hearth, the matrons with their fans, the men of the old families who had gone very still, and came back to him. And there was something behind her composure now that was not malice and not even grief, but a kind of exhausted, scorched earth finality, the look of a woman who has decided that if she cannot have the thing, she will at least not lose it cheaply. You all heard. The wardship is invoked. Let the elders convene. A sound moved through the room. Not a gasp. The old houses did not gasp, but a long, indrawn breath, 100 fans clicking shut, the particular rustle of a crowd that has just watched something it will be talking about for a generation. What is she talking about? Hermione said very quietly to Draco. What is the wardship? He did not answer at once. His jaw had set into the hard, pale line she had learned to read, and his eyes had not left Pansy. And when he spoke, it was flat and cold, and entirely without the warmth that had filled his voice a minute before. It's old, he said. Older than the ministry. A thing the great houses kept for themselves and never wrote down, because writing it down would have let people like your office abolish it. His hand finally fell from her waist, and the loss of its warmth was a physical cold against her spine. When the heir of a warded house proposes to marry, or to bind himself, in a way the elders judge to threaten the house's survival, any member of the inner families may invoke the wardship. It convenes a council of the heads of the houses. They sit in judgment, and until they rule, the heir may not. His mouth twisted. May not do the thing. Marry, bind, choose. He's held, warded, like a child who can't be trusted with his own inheritance. He turned, finally, to look at Hermione, and the despair in his face was the worst thing she had yet seen on it. She's just frozen me, in front of everyone. She's made it so that whatever I do next, I do it as a man whose own family has been asked to decide whether he's fit to choose. And if I defy the council, if I walk out of here with you tonight, debt be damned, the way I was about to, then I'm not a man who married for love. I'm a man who broke the oldest law his world has, who proved every single thing they ever feared about a Malfoy without a leash. My mother. He stopped. His hand had closed into a fist at his side, the knuckles standing white. My mother would never be received again. Anywhere. Ever. The village women crossing the lane would be the kindest thing that happened to her. Hermione looked across the silent ballroom at Pansy, and Pansy looked back at her, and in that long-held gaze there was a whole conversation that neither of them spoke aloud. I told you, Pansy's eyes said. "I told you I would break you, and that it wouldn't be because you were nothing. This is the only weapon I had left that he couldn't simply override with that reckless, beautiful gesture, because this one doesn't go through him. It goes around him. It goes through the people he can't sacrifice. You can't fight gravity, Granger, but I can change what it pulls against." And Hermione understood, standing there in her plain crimson gown, with the warmth of his hand still ghosting at her waist, that Pansy had not done this out of spite. She had done it because it was the last move on the board, and because losing this man meant losing the only life she had ever been permitted to want, and because she was, beneath all the silk and the strategy, exactly as desperate as Hermione had become. Two women on the border of the same impossible world, in love with the same divided man, and only one of them able to live on either side of the line. The elders convened. It was done with a speed that told Hermione the machinery had been kept oiled and ready for exactly such a night, that the old houses had revived the wardship along with the season precisely so that something like this could never get out of their control. A long table was conjured at the head of the hall. The heads of the inner families took their places at it. Ancient Greengrass, hawk-faced Knot, a Selwyn matriarch so old she seemed assembled from candle wax and spite, and at the centre, white-haired and terrible, Narcissa Malfoy, who had risen from her seat by the hearth and crossed the floor with her spine like a drawn wand and taken her place to sit in judgment on her own son. That was the cruelty Hermione had not anticipated. Of course, Narcissa sat on the council. She was the head of the house in all but name, her husband a broken thing kept out of sight. Pansy had not merely frozen Draco. She had arranged it so that the woman Draco was sacrificing everything to protect would be the one forced to rule on whether he might have what he wanted. If Narcissa ruled for love, she ruined herself. If she ruled against it, she broke her son's heart with her own hand. It was perfect. It was monstrous. It was, Hermione thought, exactly the kind of thing 20 years of learning every angle of every fan in England prepared a person to do. Heir of Malfoy. It was old Knot who spoke, his voice dry as turning parchment. "You stand accused of nothing, for the wardship is not an accusation. You are held. The council will hear the matter and rule upon it, and until we rule, you will make no binding of yourself, by word or act or magic. Do you submit?" The whole room waited. Hermione waited. She watched Draco stand at the centre of the floor with the wreckage of the dance around his feet, and the woman he had chosen at his side, and the council of his world arrayed against him with his own mother at its head. And she watched him understand that there was no reckless gesture left that would not cost the very people the gesture was meant to free. That Pansy had built him a cage out of the only thing he had ever truly loved, which was his sense of what he owed. "I submit," he said. The word came out of him like something torn loose, and Hermione felt it as a wound in her own chest, and she saw Pansy across the hall close her eyes for a single instant, not in triumph, but in something that looked horribly like grief. The grief of a woman who has won the only way she knew how and is going to have to live, now, inside the having of it. "Then the matter is held," said Knot. "The council will convene in 3 days at the manor in full session and hear all parties who have standing. His dry gaze moved slowly and came to rest, to Hermione's astonishment, on her, including, it would seem, parties who have standing they did not know they possessed. The Ministry's observer will attend. The wardship is an old law, Miss Granger, and old law has old hungers. You came to audit our traditions. You will find, I think, that one of them has chosen to audit you instead. The table dissolved. The ball did not resume. There was no resuming it. The night had been spent, all its brilliance burned down to this, and the guests began to gather their cloaks in a low electric murmur, casting glances at the three figures who remained in the center of the emptying floor. The heir and the outsider, and the woman in silver who had brought the whole gilded evening down around all their heads. Narcissa came to her son. Hermione stepped back to give them the space, but not so far that she could not hear, and Narcissa did not lower her voice, because Narcissa Malfoy had not lowered her voice for anyone in 40 years. "You foolish, reckless boy," she said. But her hand, when it rose, did not strike or point. It came to rest against the side of Draco's face, and Hermione saw that it was trembling. "Do you have the smallest conception of what you've done, of what you were about to do, in front of all of them?" "Yes," Draco said. "I'm sorry. Not for the thing, for the cost of it. I never wanted you to pay the cost." "The cost?" Narcissa's eyes were very bright and very hard, and they moved past her son to Hermione and held her there, weighing her, the war heroine, the Ministry's knife, the Muggle-born woman her son had broken his world to dance with. "We will speak of the cost in 3 days," she said at last, and there was something in her voice Hermione could not read at all, something that was not refusal and was not blessing, only the cold patience of a woman who had survived a war by knowing precisely when to show her hand and when to keep it pressed flat against her chest. "All of us, including you, Miss Granger." She withdrew her hand from her son's face. I am curious what you imagine you are worth, that he should burn down 200 years of name to have you. In 3 days, you will tell me, and I will decide whether I believe you." And she turned in a sweep of dark silk and walked the length of the silent hall and was gone, leaving Hermione standing in plain crimson at the center of a ruined ball between the man who had chosen her and the woman who had frozen them both, with 3 days to learn how to argue before the assembled judgment of the oldest world in England that love was a thing worth more than survival. She did not see Draco for 2 of the 3 days. That was the first cruelty of the wardship, and the sharpest. It did not merely freeze the binding, it froze the lovers. He was held at the manor under the eyes of the council, and she was warned in a note delivered by an owl she did not recognize that any contact between them before the session would be taken as an attempt to circumvent the ruling and would count against him. So she stayed in her flat in London, in the ordinary world, with its electric lights and its rattling pipes and its blessed indifference to the angle of a fan. And she walked the floor at night and tried to build, out of statute and reason, and the one true thing she possessed, an argument that could survive contact with Narcissa Malfoy. It was harder than any case she had ever prepared, because the truth was that on the council's own terms, Pansy was right. She was the correct answer. She would preserve the house. Hermione, by every measure the old world used, was a catastrophe. a name that brought no alliance, no blood, no land, nothing but scandal and the quiet hostility of 100 families. If Hermione stood before that council and argued the case the way she argued everything, on the merits, on the ledger, she would lose, because the ledger had been written by people for whom her entire existence was a deficit. So she would have to argue something else. She would have to argue the thing she had spent her whole life mistrusting, the thing that did not appear in any statute, the thing that had no weight at all in the rooms, and yet had brought the rooms down anyway. She would have to argue gravity. On the evening of the second day, a knock came at her door, and it was Pansy. Hermione stood in the open doorway and stared at her. She looked smaller here, out of her world, in a plain travelling cloak, with the London rain in her dark hair, on a muggle landing under a flickering electric bulb. And for a moment neither of them spoke. The woman who belonged and the woman who did not, their territories reversed at last, Pansy the outsider now on Hermione's ground. "May I come in?" Pansy said. "I won't stay. I shouldn't be here at all. If the council knew, it would count against me too, and God knows I've spent enough this week. But there's a thing you need to know before tomorrow, and I find I'd rather you heard it from me than walked into that room without it." Hermione stood aside and let her in. Pansy looked about the small flat, the books in their drunken stacks, the cold tea, the single chair, with an expression Hermione could not read, and did not sit, and did not take off her wet cloak, and stood in the middle of the cramped, warm room, like a creature that had wandered somewhere it could not survive, which was, Hermione thought, exactly the phrase she herself had been the object of all winter. "You're going to lose tomorrow," Pansy said. "I want to say that plainly, because you're the sort who'd rather know. On the merits, in that room, you lose. Narcissa will let you speak, because she's curious, and because she's just enough of a romantic, under all that frost, to want to be argued out of doing the sensible thing. But she's also a mother who watched her family nearly destroyed, and she will not, in the end, choose the woman who brings nothing but more danger. She'll choose me. She always meant to choose me. The season was a formality. I was always the answer." Her voice did not waver, but her hands, Hermione saw, had found each other and gripped tight the old tell. "And I have spent 2 days discovering that I do not want to win it this way." The rain ticked against the dark window. "I invoked the wardship in a white rage," Pansy went on, lower now. "He stopped his mouth a half-inch from yours in front of every soul I've spent my life trying to impress, and something in me reached for the one weapon that could end it, and I used it, and I would use it again in that same moment, because I am not a saint, and I will not pretend to be one for your comfort. But," she drew a breath, "I have watched him these 2 days, held at the manor. I am staying there. The council requires it. And he is not a man biding his time until he can have what he wants, Granger. He is a man being slowly killed. He doesn't eat. He doesn't sleep. He sits in that library, the one where I found the 2 of you, and he stares at the chair where you stood, and when his mother speaks to him, he answers like a man under water. I have wanted that man my whole life, and I have never, not once, in 20 years, seen him look the way he has looked these 2 days at the idea of losing you. He never looked that way at the idea of losing me. he'd have been sorry. He'd have been kind. He'd have grieved me the way you grieve a thing you're fond of. He's not grieving you like that. He is grieving you like a man grieves his own life. Hermione could not speak. Her throat had closed. So, here is the thing you need, Pansy said. And now her composure cracked at last, just at the edges, just enough to show the woman underneath, the girl of 9 who had ordered her whole existence around a single want and was watching it dissolve in a London bedsit in the rain. Narcissa will ask you what you're worth. She told you she would, and she will, and she'll mean it as the cruelest question in the world, because it's the question that's been asked of you in 100 small ways all winter, and you've never once had an answer the rooms would accept. Don't try to answer it on the ledger. You'll lose. Daphne lost that way. Half the women in that world lost that way, married correct, and went cold. Answer it the way you answered me on the terrace. With the truth, the unbearable kind, the kind that doesn't perform itself. She moved toward the door, drawing her wet cloak tighter, and paused with her hand on the latch, and did not look back. And when you've said it, when you've made her believe it, if you can, I won't speak against you. That's what I came to say. I won't withdraw the wardship. I can't. It's beyond me now. Only the council can lift it. But I won't stand up in that room and fight you. I've decided I'd rather lose to gravity than win by being the only thing left standing in a house full of ruined people. I built my whole life to be his answer, Granger. I never once stopped to ask whether I wanted to be the answer to a question he'd only ever asked out of duty. Her voice went very soft. You taught me that this winter. The outsider taught the woman who knew every rule that knowing the rules isn't the same as being wanted. I should hate you for it. I find I mostly just feel tired. And she opened the door and went out into the rain and the flickering electric light and was gone, leaving Hermione standing in her small warm flat with the weight of an enemy's surrender in her hands, which was somehow heavier than the enmity had ever been. The third day came grey and bitter, with a hard sky pressing down on the frozen fields, and Hermione travelled to the manor for the last time. The council sat in the great hall where the ball had been, but the brilliance was gone from it now. The candles were lit against the grey day, but they did not float, and the long table stood bare, and the heads of the houses sat behind it, with their faces composed into the patient cruelty of people who have judged many things and expect to be moved by none of them. Narcissa at the centre, Knot and Greengrass, and the wax-and-spite Selwyn matriarch. And to one side, alone, Draco, pale, hollow-eyed, exactly as Pansy had described him, a man being slowly killed, held there to hear his fate decided and forbidden to speak in his own cause, because the wardship judged the heir incapable, by definition, of knowing his own good. He looked up when Hermione entered, and across the cold grey hall their eyes met, and she saw 2 days of not eating and not sleeping written in his face. And she saw something else underneath it, something that steadied when it found her, the way a compass steadies when it finally faces north. And she held his gaze and tried to put into hers everything she could not say aloud. I'm here. I came. Whatever this costs, I came. And I am not going to argue this on the ledger, and I am not going to lose you to a law older than the ministry, without making them look at exactly what they're choosing to destroy. Miss Granger. Narcissa's voice cut the cold air. You have standing before this council, by a quirk of the old law your own ministry would dearly love to abolish, and you have, I am told, prepared an argument. You are known for your arguments. They say you can take a statute apart like a clock and show the rooms, the gears. She folded her pale hands on the bare table, and her eyes, so like her son's, fixed on Hermione with a weight that pinned her where she stood. But I am not going to let you make it. I have read enough briefs in my life to know how they end. Instead, I am going to ask you the question I promised you, and you are going to answer it before this council, plainly, without the clock and the gears, and I will know, I have always known, whether what I am hearing is the truth or only a very clever woman's idea of it. She leaned forward, and the whole hall seemed to lean with her, and Draco half rose from his chair and was pressed back into it by a glance from Not, and Pansy, seated apart in her silver with her hands folded and her face very still, did not move at all. My son has offered to burn 200 years of name to the ground to have you. So tell me, Miss Granger, and tell me true, with all of us listening and his whole life in the balance, and no clever argument to hide behind. What are you worth? The hall was so silent that Hermione could hear the candles burning, the small, dry whisper of the flames eating the wax. And she stood in her plain, dark travelling clothes before the assembled judgment of the oldest world in England, and understood that she had, at last, arrived at the only room in her life she could not argue her way out of, because Narcissa was right. She had prepared an argument. She had it folded in her mind like a brief, clean and ordered and devastating, and she could have stood there and taken the wardship apart like a clock, shown them its gears, proved it an instrument of exactly the consolidation of old blood power her reports had documented all winter. And it would have been true, and it would have been brilliant, and it would have lost, because she would have been answering the question they wanted her to answer, the ledger question, the one she could never win, instead of the question that was actually being asked. What are you worth? She let the brief go. She felt it go, felt herself set down the clock and the gears and the whole armoury of reason she had spent her life perfecting, and stood empty-handed before them, with nothing left but the one thing Pansy had told her to use, the unbearable kind of truth, the kind that does not perform itself. Nothing, Hermione said. By your ledger. I want to begin there, because we all know it, and I won't insult this council by pretending otherwise. Her voice was steady, which surprised her. I bring no name you'd recognize, no alliance, no blood you'd value, no land, no vault, no history written in any book your houses keep. By every measure you've used to weigh a marriage for 200 years, I am a deficit. If you put me on the scale against Pansy Parkinson, I don't tip it. I don't move it at all. She is the correct answer, and I am a catastrophe. And any sensible council weighing the survival of a house would choose her without a second thought, and you all know that too, and so does she, and so do I. A murmur moved along the table. Narcissa's expression did not change. So, I'm not going to argue that I'm worth more than her, Hermione went on. I can't. It isn't true. On your terms, she is worth 100 of me, and I have spent this entire winter being shown in 100 small kind cruelties exactly how true that is. I didn't come here to tell you I'm worth more." She drew a breath and turned her head and looked, not at Narcissa, but at Draco, who sat pressed back in his chair with his hands gripping the arms of it, and his face open and ruined and fixed on her, as though she were the last solid thing in a dissolving world. "I came here to tell you what I'm worth to him, which is a different question entirely, and the only one that matters, and the one your ledger has never once known how to ask." She kept her eyes on Draco, and she let herself, for the first time since the very first night, simply look at him without guarding her face. And she spoke to him as though the hall and the council and the candles had all fallen away. "You told me in the library that belief was a luxury for people who had a choice about what they are. And I have thought about that every night since, because it's the saddest thing anyone has ever said to me, and because it's wrong. You do have a choice. You've always had it. You just decided a long time ago that a man like you wasn't permitted to make it, and you called that decision duty, and you wore it like a debt, and you let it cost you your whole life, because being owed felt safer than being free." Her voice caught, and she let it catch, because Pansy had told her not to perform, and she was past performing now. "You said you'd been saving up things to say to me, as though it humiliated you. Do you know what I've been doing, Draco? The same thing. For a month. I'd think of something in the middle of the ordinary world, in my ordinary flat, with my ordinary life that everyone keeps reminding me I can go back to. And I'd think, I'll tell him that. And then I'd remember, and it would go through me like a blade, that I had no right to be saving things up for you, that I was the ministry's knife at your family's throat, that there was no version of either of our lives in which this was anything but a disaster." She was crying now, quietly, and she did not wipe it away, and her voice held. "And I couldn't stop either. That's what I'm worth to you, and what you're worth to me. We are both of us people who have spent our whole lives being right, being correct, doing the sensible thing, paying what we owed. And neither of us has been able to stop for one single day this winter, saving up things to say to the one person we were never, ever supposed to want. That's not a quantity. It doesn't go on a scale. I can't prove it to you the way I prove everything else. I can only tell you it's true and stand here while you decide whether you believe me." She turned, finally, back to Narcissa. "You asked what I'm worth," she said. "Here is my answer, and it's the only one I have. I am worth to your son exactly the thing that no name and no alliance and no correct marriage has ever once been able to give him in his entire life. I am the thing he wanted for no reason but that he wanted it. And you can rule against that. You have the power. The law is yours. You can choose survival, and it would be the sensible choice. And Pansy would make him a fine, cold, correct life, and your village women would keep crossing to the right side of the lane. But you'd be doing to him exactly what was done to you. You married correct. I've read enough this winter to know your story too. You married the name and the duty and the debt, and you survived it. And it cost you something you've spent 40 years pretending you didn't lose. So when you ask what I'm worth..." Her voice dropped and went very gentle and very level. "I think you already know. I think you've known since the night he walked through the figure. I think the only question left in this room isn't whether I'm worth it. It's whether you can bear to let your son have the thing you weren't allowed." The silence after she finished was absolute. Narcissa Malfoy sat very still behind the bare table, and her face had not changed, and her pale hands were folded, and for a long moment Hermione thought she had lost, that she had reached too far, said the one thing too true to be forgiven, and that the cold, composed woman at the centre of the council would now, in retaliation for being seen, rule against love out of pure wounded pride. And then Hermione saw it, the one tell, the thing she had learned to read all winter, on Draco, on Pansy, on herself. Narcissa Malfoy's folded hands had tightened against each other until the knuckles stood white, bone pale, the single crack in 40 years of frost, and her eyes, fixed on Hermione, had gone bright and glassed, and she did not blink, because to blink would have been to let the brightness fall, and Narcissa Malfoy did not weep in front of the heads of the houses. She rose. "The council," she said, and her voice was perfectly steady, which made the white knuckles all the more terrible, "has heard the matter." She did not look at Knot or Greengrass or the Selwyn matriarch. She did not put it to a vote. She was the head of the house in all but name, and the wardship had been invoked over her heir, and she alone, Hermione understood, had ever had the standing to lift it. "When I was a girl," Narcissa said to the hall, to all of them, in the voice of a woman who had not spoken these words aloud in 4 decades, "I was presented in a season very like this one, and I was correct. I was the answer to every question my name could ask, and I have been correct every day since, through a war and a trial, and the slow ruin of everything I was correct for. And I have one son, and he is sitting in that chair having offered to burn the whole of it to the ground for a woman who brings nothing to this house but the one thing the house has never had." Her bright, unblinking eyes moved to Draco, and her composure held and held and held. "Survival," she said, "is not the same as a life. I learned that too late to use it. I find I do not have the stomach to teach it to my son the same way." She lifted one pale hand, and the candles flared, and the air of the great hall went taut as a drawn wire. "The wardship is lifted. The matter is closed. My son may bind himself as he chooses, and any house that wishes to cross to the other side of the lane for it may do so, and find that the Malfoys have survived worse than the disapproval of the Selwyns." And the wax and spite matriarch made a sound like a kettle, and Narcissa ignored her utterly. And across the hall, Draco was on his feet at last, unheld, unfrozen, 2 days of dying falling off him all at once. And he was looking at Hermione the way a man looks at the first light after the longest night of his life. And Hermione found that she could not move at all, because the whole winter had narrowed to this single point, and she had won. And she did not yet dare to believe it. He crossed the hall to her, and this time no one stopped him. There was no figure to break, no pattern to scatter, no counsel to forbid it. Only the bare grey length of the great hall, and the candles burning low against the winter afternoon, and Draco Malfoy walking toward her through the wreckage of his whole inherited world, with 2 days of grief sliding off his shoulders, and his eyes fixed on her face, as though he could not quite trust that she would still be there when he arrived. The heads of the houses watched. Pansy watched, very still in her silver. Narcissa watched, her white knuckles only now beginning to ease their grip on each other. And Hermione stood and let him come, because she had run out of arguments, run out of reasons, run out of every defense she had ever built, and there was nothing left in her at all but the wanting she had spent a winter refusing to name. He stopped before her. Close, too close for any propriety the rooms recognized, and neither of them cared any longer what the rooms recognized. And for a moment, he simply looked at her, and his hand rose between them the way it had risen in the library that first night, the signet catching the dying light, hovering a half-inch from her cheek, with the warmth of his palm reaching across the gap to her skin without a single point of contact. "Last time," he said, very low, only for her. "A door opened and I lost my nerve, and my hand fell, and I told myself it was honor." His voice was not quite steady. "There is no door this time. There is no counsel. There is nothing left to lose that I haven't already given away gladly. So I am going to ask you, Granger, plainly in front of all of them, and you may say no, and I will survive it. But I am finished pretending I don't want the answer." His thumb moved, and at last, closed the half-inch, and his hand came to rest against the side of her face, warm and certain, and she felt the cool band of the ring against her cheekbone, and turned her face into his palm without deciding to. "May I?" "Yes," Hermione said, and he kissed her. It was nothing like the thing the ball had nearly produced, that had been a public gesture, a flag planted, a statement aimed at a watching room. This was none of those things. This was quiet. This was a man who had spent 5 years being correct, and a winter being warded, and 2 days being slowly killed, leaning down in a cold grey hall to press his mouth to the mouth of the one person he had never been permitted to want, with a care so complete it was almost unbearable. His hand cradling her jaw, his other arm coming around her to draw her in, the whole of him going still and certain at once, as though, after a lifetime of arithmetic, he had finally arrived at a sum that needed no checking. Hermione's hands found the front of his coat and fisted in the dark wool, and she rose into it, and the great hall and the council and the candles all fell away exactly as she had needed them to, and there was nothing in the world but the warmth of him, and the cedar and cold scent she had carried home on a borrowed coat, and lain awake breathing, and the slow, deep, deliberate truth of being wanted by the one person she had been most afraid to want in return. When they broke apart, she was crying again and laughing at the same time. And so she saw, astonishingly, was he, or near enough to it, the shutter gone from his face entirely, nothing left behind it but a man who had stopped, finally and forever, doing the sums of what he owed the dead, and started doing the only sum that had ever made him happy. "You ruined yourself," she whispered, the same words she'd said in the dance, but soft now, wondering. "You actually did it." "I ruined nothing." His forehead came down to rest against hers. "I spent 5 years thinking my whole worth was in keeping a thing standing, and the moment I let it fall, do you know what I found underneath?" His hand tightened at her waist. "More of my life than I'd had in all the years of holding it up. That's not ruin, Granger. That's the first honest accounting I've ever done." Somewhere behind them, a chair scraped. Hermione turned, still within the circle of his arm, and found Pansy on her feet. The silver of her gown caught the grey light, and her face was composed, perfectly composed, the way it had been at the ball when everything she had built came down. But Hermione knew now how to read the cost beneath that composure, and she saw it, and she did not look away from it, because she felt that Pansy had earned at least the dignity of being seen. "Well," Pansy said. Her voice was light. It cost her something to make it light. Hermione could hear the toll in it. "That's that, then." She came toward them across the hall, unhurried, queen of the floor even now, even in defeat, and stopped before the two of them, and looked at Draco for a long moment with an expression that held 20 years of wanting and the slow, hard work of setting it down. "I'm not going to pretend to be glad," she said to him. "I'd be insulting all three of us. I wanted you my whole life, and I lost, and it will take me a long time to be a person who doesn't, somewhere underneath everything, still want you. I'm not going to perform a blessing I don't feel." Her chin lifted. "But I withdrew from the field before the ruling. I went to her flat in the rain, and I told her I wouldn't fight her, and I meant it. And I want you both to know I meant it, because I should like, when I'm an old woman, to remember that I lost the one thing I ever truly wanted well, that I was, at the very end, after a winter of being merciless, capable of one decent act." Her eyes moved to Hermione, and something passed between the two women. The whole long, strange war of the season distilled into a single look. "You taught me that knowing the rules isn't the same as being wanted," she said. "It's the cruelest thing anyone's ever done to me. I think it might also be the truest. I expect I'll thank you for it eventually, not today." "Pansy," Hermione said, "I'm sorry." "Truly?" "Not for him. I won't lie to you either. I'm not sorry for him. But for the cost. I never wanted it to cost you everything." "I know." Pansy's composure flickered, just at the edges, the white-knuckled tell of a woman holding herself together by main force. "That's the maddening thing about you, Granger. You actually mean it. It would be so much easier if you were cruel." She drew a breath and gathered the silk of her ruined ambition around her like a cloak and stepped back. "I'm going to go now, before I do something undignified. There are other houses, other seasons. I know every rule in England, and somewhere out there is a man who'll be glad of it, and perhaps—" her voice steadied. "Perhaps I'll even let myself find out whether I can want someone who actually wants me back. You've quite spoiled correctness for me. I hope you're satisfied." And she turned, in a last sweep of silver, and walked the length of the great hall with her spine straight and her chin high. And at the door, she paused and did not look back, and said only, "Be happy. Both of you. Make it worth what it cost." And then she was gone, out into the grey winter, to begin the long work of building a life she had never once been taught to want for its own sake. The hall emptied slowly after that. The heads of the houses departed with their faces composed into the careful neutrality of people who would spend the next year deciding how to feel about what they had witnessed. The Selwyn matriarch left making the kettle sound. And at last, only Narcissa remained, standing alone at the head of the bare table, watching her son with his arm around the ministry's knife. And Hermione disentangled herself gently and crossed the hall to her, because she felt that this too was owed. "Thank you," Hermione said. "Don't." Narcissa's voice was cool, But the frost had a crack in it now, a hairline fracture that would never quite close again. I didn't do it for you. I did it for him, and for the girl I was, who didn't have anyone to lift the wardship when it was invoked over her. Her bright eyes searched Hermione's face, weighing her one final time. The war heroine, the catastrophe, the deficit who had stood in this hall and answered the cruelest question in the world with the truth, and somehow turned it into a key. You said I'd known since the night he walked through the figure. You were right, and I resented you bitterly for being right, and I resent you still. A pause, and then, grudging, costly, real. He's been a ghost for 5 years, Miss Granger, correct and dutiful and dead behind the eyes. I had begun to think I would never see him alive again. Her gaze went past Hermione to Draco, and the brightness in her eyes climbed and held and did not fall. He's alive. You did that. I find I can forgive a great deal of a woman who brought my son back to life. Not everything, but a great deal. She inclined her head, a fraction, the precise fraction, and Hermione understood at last that she had finally been offered the one form of address the rooms had withheld from her all winter, the small bow given between equals. You'll come to dinner, Narcissa said, not as the ministry's observer, as... She paused, and the words seemed to cost her, and she paid it anyway. As family. There will be a great deal you don't know about how to go on in this world, and a great deal I find I no longer care whether you ever learn. We'll manage. Houses survive worse than love. Mine has survived almost everything else. And she swept past them both and was gone, leaving the two of them alone at last in the emptied hall, with the candles guttering low and the grey afternoon going blue at the windows. Draco came to her. He took both her hands in his and turned them over and pressed his mouth to the cold knuckles of each in turn, and then simply held them and looked at her in the failing light with everything written plain in his face that he had spent a lifetime learning to hide. I have no idea how to do this, he said. Any of it. I was raised to do exactly one thing, and I've just spent the afternoon burning it to the ground, and I genuinely do not know what a man like me does next, when there's no debt left to pay, and no name left to keep, and nothing standing between me and the thing I want. You learn, Hermione said. We both do. Neither of us knows. That's rather the point. We're both of us on the wrong side of a line we were never supposed to cross, and there's no rule book for the other side, and we'll have to make the whole thing up as we go. She lifted one hand to his face and felt the warmth of him, and the slight rough catch of his jaw, and the cool press of the ring as he turned to kiss her palm. I spent the entire winter being told I didn't know the codes, that every gesture was against me, that I was speaking a language I'd never learned. She smiled, and the last of the winter's cold went out of her at last. And it turns out the only code that ever mattered was the one I knew best of all, the truth, said plainly, to the one person you were never supposed to want. Outside, the early winter dark came down over the frozen grounds, and the first snow of the new year began to fall past the tall windows, slow and silver and soundless, settling over the dead gardens and the frozen fountain and the long lane the village women crossed, and inside the warm gold ruin of the great hall, in the place where a season had been built to keep two people apart and had failed, Draco Malfoy drew Hermione Granger into his arms and kissed her again, unhurried now, unhaunted, with all the time in the world, and no door left to open and no counsel left to forbid it. And she rose into him and held him, and let herself, finally, be exactly where the whole long winter had been trying to send her all along, which was home.
Thank you for staying with me to the end of this story. I want to talk to you for a moment like a friend. When I wrote this, I thought a lot about one idea, the idea that knowing the rules is not the same as being loved. Pansy knew every rule. She knew how to hold a fan. She knew how to enter a room. She was perfect. But being perfect did not make him want her. Hermione knew nothing. She held her fan like a fishwife. She made mistakes in front of everyone, but she had one thing. She told the truth. There is a moment I keep thinking about, the moment in the ballroom. The dance breaks. She stands alone in the center. She does not know the steps, and he walks to her and says, "So we'll do it badly together." That is the whole story for me. Doing it badly together is better than doing it perfectly alone. So, what is the lesson? I think it is simple. You do not have to be correct to be loved. You do not have to know every rule. You just have to be honest. You just have to be brave enough to want something out loud. That is hard. It was hard for them. It was hard for all of us. But is it worth it? Thank you for listening. Take care of your heart, and I will see you in the next story.